Hello Data Nation and welcome to theCUBE's live coverage of the Snowflake Summit 2025 here at the Moscone Center in San Francisco, California. I'm your host, Rebecca Knight, alongside my co-host and analyst, Dave Vellante. Also joining us is George Gilbert, another analyst at theCUBE who is an esteemed opinion maker, so thank you so much.
Good to see you, Rebecca, it's been a while.
It has been a while, it's lovely to be here.
Yeah, San Francisco is hopping. I tell you, this conference feels like it's much bigger. I don't know what the numbers are, but I would say it's kind of 15,000-ish. We were here last night, you couldn't even walk around this area. Unfortunately, theCUBE wasn't, we should have done CUBE after dark on Monday night. But you know, George, 2 years ago, actually 3 years ago here, we started to see this company, and Rebecca, I can't remember if you were here or not, but anyway, we started to see this company in transition where I remember Benoit Dageville said, has anybody out there heard of Iceberg? And like 3 hands went up. I was one of them because I happened to stumble across it. And now, if you asked that same question, every hand would go up. But it just was a signal that Snowflake saw what was coming. I don't think at the time they understood the impact. And of course the Databricks competition accelerated that, but really what it's about is customers dragging them into the world of open. And of course, you've done enough of these CUBE gigs to know the power of open and the leverage that it brings.
Indeed, and that seemed to be a key message of the keynote. All of us are fresh from the keynote. It was audio-visually arresting with a beautiful symphony playing in the background and lines of code, and it was very cool. Lots of bigwigs from the company. As you said, Benoit Dageville was up there, Christian Kleinerman. They also brought up some top customers. You were also both at Analyst Day. George, why don't you give me your high-level thoughts about what was talked about and really picking up on what Dave was saying, that this is a company in transition that has the power to see.
So from both an end user point of view and a developer and administrator point of view, I saw them reinforcing the simplicity message that's always differentiated them, and we'll get into that, but the way they used AI, the way they used the catalog, the functionality they added, it all added up to that integrated simplicity that differentiated them. But also then underneath, they made a lot of progress on the architectural transition where they were the ones who pioneered cloud native, separate compute from storage. But now, as Dave pointed out with Iceberg, we're transitioning to separating compute from data where the customer and no vendor owns the data, and that's a huge shift. So every vendor has to compete for every workload because they don't lock up the data in their DBMS. And they made a lot of progress in that direction this year, which we'll get into.
I mean, I put a tweet out during Benoit's keynote where we were just really kind of discussing not only his announcements, and I would encourage you to go there, but basically that transition that they're in. I mean, you noticed a couple of years ago, they were being forced to open up. One of the key things that, George, your research saw is that customers were taking the data engineering work out of Snowflake, putting it into a Spark execution engine like a Databricks or an EMR for cost reasons. And remember, Snowflake, you know, Benoit he basically said it, we're doubling down. He didn't use the word doubling down, but he said, my words, on simplicity and governance, so that it's trusted. So, but basically that requires you to put everything inside of Snowflake. And as you pointed out many times, George, it bundles in the hardware from AWS. So whether it was perceived or real, there was seemed to be a TCO disadvantage for that data engineering work. Low value work, you know, it's like just getting the site ready, it's scraping the paint. And then so, they were doing that outside of Snowflake. They've addressed that with new pricing. We heard some new pricing today. I don't know if they've announced it yet, but we're going to see some capabilities to go after the data science persona. So that was a very high priority because that data engineering workload is so important, that data scientist persona.
And the two of them, and the reason why they needed to get the data engineering workloads, besides the fact that even when they weren't getting all of them, it was like 35% of their compute, but compute cycles was data engineering. And with Databricks, it was, several years back, Bob Muglia estimated it might have been 80% of their workloads. I mean, that's where they started with doing the pipelines. But the several things that Snowflake did that really addressed this. One, their Snowpark Java support matured. So with Spark, you could do PySpark, Java, Scala, and data engineers like to work often in those languages in addition to the DBT SQL support. But then they addressed the pricing model problem, which was bundling the hardware for what were very cost-sensitive workloads. So they have two options now. It's essentially a serverless function where other vendors have to offer that, so everyone has to mark up the hardware, so there's no disadvantage there.
Databricks in particular,
Yes,
let's call them out.
Or bring your own compute, which means you don't have to buy the Snowflake hardware markup. So between the adding the languages, adding the compute option, and then adding much more high performance Snowpipe, it's like 50% of the cost now. They sped it up and they did data volume based pricing. So those three issues. Now the reason that's important, it's not just because of, it's like it was 30% of the workloads and could be more, it's that the lineage graph, the data lineage comes from your data engineering workloads. And the lineage graph is what you hang all the operational metadata off. That's the backbone of your catalog.
All right, so let's sort of back up because you're probably losing a few people here.
Okay.
But it's good. So let me sort of set the framework. So we saw, one thing I just want to call out again on my Twitter post, Marriott announced adaptive computing. I don't think I've ever seen that before.
No, the customer.
We might have saw it at UiPath one time.
Well, because it was a very candid comment about, did Snowflake work for you? Yes and no. And so here's how we came up with it.
It was a good setup. And so I've never seen a customer, I can't recall, announcing Snowflake adaptive compute. Yeah. Now, that's kind of cool because remember, Snowflake for years has had these t-shirt sizes. You had to pick small, medium, and large, and it worked pretty well. It was very simple. But it wasn't perfect because you couldn't have that granularity, and if you went over, and it got kind of complicated. Oracle, by the way, a couple years ago used to attack Snowflake on this, and so, with a more granular, sizing option. So Snowflake's taking care of that. But the bigger picture here is, as I said before, Benoit doubled down on simplicity. He said enabling data to be connected and shared, and he's bringing this ethos to AI so that it's trusted. I mean, Snowflake, frankly, was nowhere in AI 3 or 4 years ago. They didn't really have a great ML story. Now they've catapulted themselves into a leading company, technology company in AI, and they've got a compelling value prop that's differentiated because everything is in that Snowflake, big blanket. So their near-term priority, as we talked about, was to go after the data science persona. They're dealing with that. They were getting a lot of competition in that space. And so, when you think about it, George, the other thing that's happening is they have to open up, and Rebecca. So by opening up, there's an interesting trend going on. So the point of control for Snowflake has always been the database. That's migrating to the governance catalog. And the governance catalog is becoming open source in many cases. Unity, Polaris, some proprietary ones as well. So the value keeps going up. So that creates interesting challenges for Snowflake. On the one hand, their differentiation is that they have this walled garden and they can control everything. On the other hand, customers in the market and competition is forcing them to open up. So as a result, they have to lean into that trend or they're going to end up, driftwood.
But what they did that was really clever, that they did not tell us about last year in terms of a statement of direction, was that first, their catalog is tied to their DBMS, unlike others where the catalog is a separate product. But what they did that was very clever was they announced Polaris, fully open source last year. It's not only an open source product, it's also a spec that others can implement. So now what they're doing is taking more and more of the Horizon catalog richness, migrating it to Polaris or the open source spec. And so you get richer and richer open source catalog to manage the external Iceberg data, but it's synchronized with Horizon.
Okay, so just coming back to kindergarten for a moment, because there was a really important point that you just made. So the value's moving up the stack, okay, and as they lean into open table formats like Iceberg, to your point, there's more of the proprietary Horizon functionality that people will pay up for, the value, trickling into the open world. So that puts greater pressure on Snowflake to have the absolute very best engine.
Yes.
And, which I think they're announcing it today, that like the next generation engine, so it's going to be bigger, better, faster, and more economic. But it also requires them to bring that capability to the open world. So they not only have to be the best engine, they have to be the best at managing all those open table formats. Go ahead.
This is where, before, the perception on Snowflake was they're really good when they're managing native tables, their own proprietary format, and their own managed version of Iceberg, meaning where they control the reads and writes to Iceberg. What's changed now is with the Polaris catalog synchronized with Horizon, they moved the permissions, they synchronized permissions with, I know this sounds a little techie, but the point is now their engine can manage read-write access, so they can do data engineering, the analytic workloads, data science on external Iceberg tables.
So let me translate.
Yeah.
So what that means is that the external open experience is much more like the Snowflake experience.
Yes.
Maybe not as controlled,
yeah.
maybe not fully, but as close, I mean substantially similar, and that's the game now, that's the race. So the question is, coming back to the value stack movement, what can Snowflake and is Snowflake doing to maintain its value advantage? There was I heard on TV this morning, the 4 most highly valued, overvalued was the implication, but highly valued on a valuation standpoint, former securities analyst, Palantir #1, I think CrowdStrike was #2, I think Snow was #3 or 4, I think Zscaler was up there. So they're still, even though their stock price is way down from its previous high, they're still priced at a premium for perfection. So what can they do? Because they have such high value. So what can they do to preserve that value? They have to create that open experience. Their proprietary experience has to be great, and they've got some decisions to make. Are they just basically data infrastructure that's serving up agentic platforms, or are they going to become the agentic platform that goes after the 2 new layers that we've talked about? Layer 1 being, let's call it the harmonization layer, taking all that disparate data, the structured data, the unstructured data, the different formats, and bringing it all together so that it all makes sense as a true single version of the truth. And then that's one layer, and then feeding the high value, then feeding that up to the agentic control framework that can interpret the top-down metrics tree, which is, again, they've hinted toward metrics trees. Those 2 new areas of the software stack are emerging, and Snowflake either will go after, whoever owns that will have a lot of leverage in the future. There's still tons of opportunity, even if you don't own that, but whoever owns that is going to be the highest value software company in the world, and it's going to leave the rest of it for a lot of specialty opportunities.
One thing worth mentioning is that there was the perception that they were limited to doing really good work, really good workloads when they own the data. But by synchronizing with Polaris, their engine now competes with any other engine working on open Iceberg tables for data engineering, for analytics. In other words, they're getting net new workloads or net new data to apply their workloads to.
And it's showing up in their financials. I mean, their last quarter was a statement quarter. They grew revenue 26%. They're on track to be a $4 billion company this fiscal year. Their long-term goal is to be a $10 billion company, so they're talking an incremental $6 billion. So Snowflake has always wanted to be the next great software company, like ServiceNow became, certainly like Salesforce before it. But as it goes up the stack, same thing is true for Databricks, as it moves up the stack, it's now entering the domain of the application vendors who have the business logic, the process logic, all trapped inside their application domain. And the big question is, how does Snowflake get access to that? Can they get access through connectors? And then how do they harmonize all that data? Do they want to go after that? Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I feel as though, to your point before, it's going to be driven by customers in terms of what they're demanding, what they need, and how they are plotting their AI futures.
So that's actually a great point, because like when we talked to the head of platform yesterday, he was like, so for this year, the hard work is synchronizing native Horizon catalog with the open Polaris so that they can manage the entire native and Iceberg data estate and apply all their workloads. But following on that, there are some very big advanced customers like AT&T and others who are working with Snowflake partners like relational AI to do really advanced business intelligence and knowledge graphs where they're moving up into the application semantics. And what the head of platform told us is that's 12 months out where we see, can they start building a model of your enterprise by abstracting all the business logic into this knowledge graph. That's partner
by the
work.
way,
yeah.
Last night at the keynote, it was Sridhar Ramaswamy, the CEO. It was, Sridhar's solid. He's clearly a technical CEO. It was very scripted. Fine, that's who Sridhar is. That's cool. Lynn Martin, president of NYSE, she was good, talking about risk at scale. And then Sam Altman was the headline. And Sarah, I forget how you say her last name, Gao? Sarah Gao. Whoa. Who's great. She was the moderator. And Sam Altman was there. He didn't say a ton. I was surprised that they didn't talk about the fact that Snowflake, or at least a lot about, is basically integrating OpenAI tooling. I think 04 and 01. OpenAI is dominating the LLM game, even though some would argue it's commodity. And Snowflake's offering choice, of course, with Anthropic and Mistral and others. But I bring that up because A, I thought it was a missed opportunity. OpenAI is really doing well in the LLM world. The second is, George and I wrote a piece a while back why Jamie Dimon is Sam Altman's biggest competitor. And the premise of that was that Jamie Dimon and JPMC are never going to put their 2 exabytes of data out in the internet to be trained by OpenAI. At the same time, if OpenAI models come into the Snowflake world and are applied to enterprise AI data, I presume that data stays in the enterprise. I presume it doesn't leak.
That was the point of having them, those models, the data does not, I believe you have the option so that the data does not leave your boundary and get consumed by or trained on
by OpenAI. And so then my question is, can Sam Altman have his cake and eat it too and not gain weight? In other words, can he play in both that consumer market at massive scale, whatever, 120 million users a day, whatever the number is.
The API market.
Yeah, through the API market, can he also win the enterprise? And God knows what he's doing with Johnny Ives.
But Dave, I think the bigger issue is the API market, it's got gargantuan capital requirements, multiple competitors, and the lead of the frontier models is only 6 to at most 12 months over either another frontier or the open source guys like coming from China or Meta. So the value add is, can you model your data and apply the AI to extract value? And that means the value comes to who can present a model of that data to extract value from it, which is why we say Jamie Dimon, meaning the enterprise customer who can model the data.
And that's where the value is.
Yes.
So you remember Netscape, they were the hottest company on the planet in whatever it was 90, whatever, early days of the .com. And then when it became clear that the value was shifting to the enterprise.
The search engine.
They said, they said, well, the search engine, they just kind of missed that. But then so what they did is they pivoted to enterprise and they said, we'll be the access to the intranet. Well, that didn't work either.
Right.
And then they got demoed by all the other software vendors who owned the enterprise. I mean, I'm not predicting the same thing happens to OpenAI because today's management and Sam Altman's seen that before and they're smarter today and they're better capitalized. But to your point, if that business becomes commoditized, the foundation model business and the AGI business, that could present problems for them. I would say this, I think they believe that whoever gets to AGI first, whatever AGI is, will have some significant competitive advantages. And that's what they're going after.
But there's also some issues with using the models. Like one of the things they've talked about, probably more than anything else over the last 12 months, is talk to your data for the business user. so
Say
that
again?
they
I didn't hear
talk to your data, text to SQL,
through natural language. Yeah.
Yeah, and we've talked about this. They have the semantic views, which are the definitions of the metrics and dimensions. You need that. That's a way of modeling your data so that an LLM can talk to it and understand the structure.
This is what you call, I think, taking what humans think of as things and translating it into strings that databases can understand through the language of database, which is SQL.
Yes, so the metric and dimension layer is the human language, and that translates into SQL language, so they put a lot of effort into this, but the big question is, when you want to talk to your data, they say it's a feature not to have to use dashboards or SQL, but when it returns the data, how does it present it?
Okay.
How does it visualize
now, fusing, Rebecca, the 101 that I was talking about and the 301 that George is talking about. So you've got text to SQL, which is things to strings. So what about people? What about places? What about processes? That's the 4-dimensional map that you talk about, because ultimately our vision is that organizations want to build a digital twin or a digital representation of their enterprise so that in real time, systems of agency or agentic systems can take action.
Yes.
And the enterprise can respond much more quickly with far less labor costs. So what is Snowflake's value add in that equation? Very clearly, you've got to have strong data foundation to do that. That would be great. And that's a really lucrative market. They could choose to sort of stay there and dominate that, or they could really kind of go after the even higher value ground, which we think Salesforce is going after, and maybe Palantir and ServiceNow and some others, which is those layers that we talked about, the system of intelligence and the system of agency. And it remains to be seen. I think they have to be careful, because if they go hard after that and declare that that's their new North Star, companies like Salesforce are going to say, whoa, maybe you're not partners. Maybe we don't want to partner with you guys. So they have to sort of figure out how to enter that market, if in fact they even want to get there. And they have some choices to make technically with partners like Relational AI and Blue Yonder.
Also, just saying you have text to SQL, it's not a binary yes, no. It's a very difficult problem to get high accuracy for complex queries on complex schemas.
Because it's a probabilistic AI.
And one of the things their close partner, Relational AI, just announced yesterday was world-leading, top of the leaderboard text to SQL accuracy, and they're doing that with their customer AT&T. And we talked to the head of platform. He's like, the companies are getting closer, and we know there's a showcase ISV for Snowflake, which is Blue Yonder. Yeah. And they're building their entire application suite, the supply chain suite, on Relational AI. So we're going to see emerging what's really a next generation application stack, which was what Snowflake always wanted to be.
Well, but so Snowflake talks about they have one SKU.
Yeah.
And that SKU is based on one database. Well, they just bought Crunchy, which is a Postgres database. Do they integrate that into their one SKU, or is that a separate database? And how would they integrate like a Relational AI? Let's say they acquired a company like Relational AI or partner with them. Do they integrate that? Is it still one database?
It could be.
Like Oracle, although Oracle has MySQL HeatWave, so they actually have a couple of databases. But
I think it still can be one SKU, because instead of putting the transaction, if you want to execute a transaction to operationalize a decision, normally you got to go to another application through reverse ETL.
So again, 101 to 301.
Yeah.
We're talking here about, companies like Snowflake are basically, historical systems of analytics, right? I mean, it's what happened. And you can apply AI to say what's likely to happen. But when you get into, you've made this point many times, George, what should we do next?
Right.
And with confidence.
Right.
And allowing agents to actually take that action. that's a whole different
These
ballgame.
are existential questions, and
Yeah.
we are going to get into all of them over the next
Yeah.
2 days of our live coverage of the Snowflake Summit. We're going to have a lot of Snowflake executives on, as well as customers, partners, people from Whoop,
Awesome.
USA Today, JP Morgan Chase, Affirm, Box, AWS. It's going to be a great show. I look forward to working with both of you.
Thanks for hanging with us and letting us rip on that. That was
I know,
great, George.
exactly. I'm Rebecca Knight for Dave Vellante and George Gilbert. Stay tuned for more of theCUBE's live coverage of Snowflake Summit 2025. You're watching theCUBE, the leader in enterprise tech news and analysis.